Thank you, Wolfgang. You'll notice in my voice, I hope it lasts. I was at a conference in Houston the last couple of days with 1,200 people. It was on Arctic technology. And just the sheer size of it and the scope tells you the interest, the economic interest of the development of the Arctic. And I had to give a couple talks, and they were an hour long. And at the second one, I started to fade a little bit, and then last night I couldn't speak. So we'll see how this goes. I got all kinds of stuff with me here. I got, I think, some good slides, so if I die out a little bit, we'll see how it goes. It's kind of neat here today at Princeton that there are 3 Coast Guard Academy graduates in the room. I mean, that's probability that happened to Nick is astronomical, right? So that class 68, well, introduce yourself, Nick.
Nick Stromanti. I live in Lawrenceville. My daughter graduated from Princeton University. I'm a coastal structural engineer. We go way back. You relieved me of my command on a patrol boat back in
Isn't that
small world.
and class?
By the way, but let me just say one thing. I was skiing in Colorado several weeks ago. I was on a ski lift with a gentleman. He was from NASA. He was a scientist. We were talking about the Arctic. Believe it or not, on a ski lift, talking about the problems in the Arctic. And he asked, "Did I know Professor Lawson Brigham?" I said, "Of course, we went to school together."
And class of 2000 Coast Guard Academy. You want to introduce yourself? What you do here?
Paul Alcala, an MVP candidate. I'll be graduating this summer. Flying desk for a while, but I was an aviator before I came here.
Yeah, Nick and I will talk to him occasionally, since he's an aviator and we're ship guys. But nice to have you both here. It shows you that the Coast Guard does get around.
Shows you something that brings some time with the mission service.
Well, it's a complex place in the Arctic today, and I titled it this mix of globalization and climate change and geopolitics. And you hear a lot about the climate change, and I think you hear a lot about the geopolitics. Maybe I can diffuse some of the notions about it. You probably don't hear as much about the globalization and the economics. I'm no economist, but I think I have a feel for the development of natural resources. The image there, I'm in a geography department, but I'm a satellite remote sensing scientist, I guess, by training. Do politics now and lots of other things. But this passive microwave image of the minimum extent of sea ice in September of 2007, the minimum on record. And you can see, as false color imagery, of course, you can see that the dark areas and the large acreage of ice-free area in the Arctic Ocean. That snapshot, of course, on that given day, which is 11 September in 2007. When I briefed the diplomats many times, a complex subject, we had to tell everyone that the global maritime industry is already in the Arctic, has been for several decades, if not longer, in various dimensions. And of course, the regulatory environment hasn't kept up with all of the activity. If you would have thought about the precautionary principle, we would have had some mandatory rules and regulations a decade or so before all of this is in the Arctic. But we don't have international standards and regulations in the Arctic today. Russia and Canada have their own standards, but there are no international standards that apply across the maritime industry. And the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is working on it. A ship that plied the Canadian Arctic for the last couple decades, the MV Arctic. Russian nuclear icebreakers, this is the Sovietsky Soyuz. This is a modern icebreaking ship. I'll speak more about it. It's Finnish-built, Russian flag. But if you look at the top sides and you see in English on this Russian flag ship, Arctic Express. And in a way that expresses the notion of this ship. Icebreaker in its own right, independently operated carrier, carries nickel plates from Norilsk, the port of Dudinka on the Yenisei River in Russia, to Murmansk. But this marketing, I'm not sure it's a Finnish idea or the Russians came up with that, but it's kind of right out of Madison Avenue in a way. And then the Interloper, all these ships are, these 3 are icebreaking ships. And they have the cruise ships. and hardly ice breaking. So the marine safety and environmental implications of these ships, this particular ship, can't read the stern of the ship and the transom. It's foreign flagship Bahamas. Well, Bahamas is not terribly interested in ice breaking standards, etc. The challenge for the Arctic states, for all of us today, the real challenge is the cruise ships in the Arctic when there's no safety net. There's very little infrastructure like the rest of the planet has in the oceans. Not much search and rescue, very little environmental response, few aids to navigation. And where this ship is operating, there are few, if no, charts. So if you're a mariner, the first thing you start about is, well, where are you, and are there any charts? And in many, we think, in doing this study, the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, charitably 5 to 6% of the Arctic Ocean is charted to international standards today. So if you start with that particular important item, charts, whether they're electronic or hard copy, doesn't matter. If you don't have charts, the other things on the list they're all important, but you have to have hydrography and charting. Let me see now if I got this right. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit about marine access and about how climate change, anthropogenic-driven, I will say, relates to this topic of marine transport. I'll talk about current marine use. I'll talk about this large study we did, some of the politics of it, and another report we have, and then I'll summarize, and then hopefully we can have some Q&As. But I thought you were going down the list there, Wolfgang, but you didn't make it all the way around. We really should talk about, I think, this is kind of geography 101, but hopefully you won't be insulted, how many Arctic states there actually are. And some in the room might say, well, the whole newspaper said there are 5. Now, there are 8 Arctic countries. 8 Arctic countries above the Arctic Circle, or on the Arctic Circle. And, of course, you know about Canada. Is it just, can you see the point? You know about Canada? Of course, Alaska, we have our little piece of the action. And the Russians have nearly 180 degrees around the Arctic basin. But then we have, Denmark's not on here, but Greenland is. So the Denmark is kind of owned Greenland for 300 years, 3 centuries. And we'll talk about Greenland a little bit more. But Denmark is a player, Arctic state. But then here we have, in this northwest Europe and northwest Russia, we have Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Of course, Norway also has Svalbard under the Spitsbergen Treaty, 1920. So there are 8 Arctic states. The system has been confused a little bit because people have focused in media, and the New York Times actually, on the 5 Arctic coastal states. But what they failed to remember, there are actually 6 Arctic coastal states, because Iceland. Iceland here is an Arctic state. The Arctic Circle just runs across the top. But when you extend the 200-mile EEZ, they are clearly geographically and geopolitically an Arctic state.
Can you say what EEZ is?
Oh yeah, the exclusive economic zone under the UNCLOS, United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, Convention on the Law of the Sea. So Iceland is a player as an Arctic, and of course they're coastal, completely coastal island. But the 5 Arctic Ocean states, the nuance is that surround the Arctic Ocean basin, that have some territory claims out into the central Arctic Ocean, Canada, United States, Russia, Norway, and Denmark. So there's a bit of a confusion. But for all of our work, and the position of the United States is the 5-nation regime relationship really isn't the dominant one. It's the 8-nation Arctic Council. So there's a little nuance in it. And I've been at a bunch of different meetings and been challenged about it all. But there's some notion that, that there are only 5 that really count. And these 3 small countries, although rich countries, they count too. Very interesting dynamic. And this Arctic shipping assessment, I use this as kind of my foundation of talking through all of the issues of how much use and whatever. The Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum. It's not treaty bound. It's a consensus organization. It's more than, you could call it a coffee drinking clutch, but of course it's more than that. But they have to have a consensus to do anything in this Arctic Council. So if you want to have a big assessment or study, environmental study, whatever, all the 8 countries have to agree, and sometimes they don't. And I'll give you an example of something they disagree on now, or there's vehement disagreement by 2 states. It's EU wants to be a observer country, well, or organization, I guess I should say, to the Arctic Council. Who do you think might be against that?
Russia.
You got it. Russia and Canada. Canada because of issues related to imports of seals from the indigenous people, or the closure of those imports or exports, however you look at it. So that's one item. And China, Korea, Japan, Italy, a couple other countries are awaiting becoming an observer to the Arctic country. But the important part of the Arctic Council, besides the 8 Arctic states with their vote, consensus, indigenous people. There are 6 indigenous groups in the Arctic Council that sit around a table with the Arctic states. Of course, they're citizens of the Arctic states, but sometimes they're kind of railing against their own country. So it was interesting to have the Gritchen or the Athabascans or Inuit sitting in their cultural group, in permanent participants are called, and kind of arguing against the United States. Of course, they're taxpayers, but they're arguing against the United States in this milieu of the Arctic Council. Very fascinating. So 6 groups. I think I can remember them all: the Inuit and the Sami, Athabascans, the Gritchen, Aleut, and the Russian indigenous people. There are 40-some different groups in Russia, but they've been homogenized into the RAPON, the Russian Arctic Indigenous Peoples Organization. And so it's an interesting mix. And it is an international experiment, bringing the indigenous people into the process of the Arctic Council and all the studies. It's a very important component. In this study, 3 countries led this thing: Canada, Finland, the United States. You'll note that Finland is a non-coastal state. You probably all know that Finland has shipbuilding interests and has built icebreakers for Soviet Union and Russia, and commercial carriers, the one I showed you. So their interests are commercial. So it's fascinating to have commercial interest on this. And I think Canada and the U.S. were on board with this for environmental protection, sustainable development reasons for policies. So we led this thing. The focus of the AMSA, this study, was marine safety, environmental protection. That fits the milieu of the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council focus and charter is on environmental protection and sustainable development. And things that we don't do, or I'm not a member of the U.S. delegation anymore, but things that the Arctic Council doesn't really engage in by agreement: fisheries management. I mean, there are all kinds of fishing management organizations around the world, and it's a complex business, we well know. Whaling, who would want to touch those issues in the Arctic Council? The International Whaling Commission handles the whaling issues. And the third issue is we don't do, in the Arctic Council, don't discuss military security issues. Well, when you talk about ships in the Arctic, and you get into the subject, it transcends all of these issues, because you have the intersection of whaling and indigenous whaling and indigenous people. You have security issues related to transits of ships and surveillance and monitoring issues in marine transport. So we really bridged in this study the whole dynamic of issues in the Arctic Council. We had a whole host of workshops, but the important ones probably were the town hall meetings out in the hinterland in northern Norway and Finnmark. We went to Iceland and Greenland, Canada, and the United States, into communities to talk with whalers, hunters, and a guy on the street that his vessel mode of operation is a kayak. So it was very interesting to outreach. Of course, we're working for the Arctic Council, so our responsibility, people sitting there, the indigenous groups, to reach out and get their sense. And there's a whole range of issues that they, of course, pointed out, and concerns, but also recognize the benefits of new marine transport. The bottom line really in this whole study is most of the stakeholders and actors are non-Arctic. So the world is coming to the Arctic. Probably going to make it a much more complex place. And the shipbuilders, the ship classification societies, the investors, the insurance industry, most of them have no experience. Many of them have no experience in polar operations in the Arctic. So we, the Arctic states, through IMO and other organizations, need to shore up the safety and regulatory environment in the Arctic. I'll show you the cover of the report. You can download it. I could send you one if you wanted one. It's about 180 pages that were negotiated. This is a unique document in the Arctic Council. There have been many studies on climate, oil and gas, scientific studies on mercury, etc. It's one of the first documents, truly a policy document, because we negotiated it, and we had lawyers from the State Department and DFATE in Canada, and working all the language of the definition of the Northwest Bay, you name it. Every word was negotiated in this document. It took 7 months. It was a real joy. People have been involved in negotiations. However, it didn't change much of the bottom line of the study. Here are the topics, just to show you what we were dealing with. Even the topics, and the picture on the cover was negotiated because we didn't want to show the flag state. I mean, just show you the nuances here. The little logo that we designed, we had to adjust it a little bit to fit the Russian viewpoint on color of the hull. So if you're worrying about that, what about the recommendations? But anyway, it's very interesting for me to be in the middle of this stuff. History, governance, of course, geography is huge. You can see we had data. We asked the Arctic states in the study to provide us their data for 2004, for the calendar year, of all the marine transport, marine activity in their region. And we didn't ask commercial industry. We asked the Arctic state. We sent an electronic survey to the diplomats. Of course, they get an electronic survey and probably had an ulcer seeing this thing come in. But of course, the answer is you pass it to your maritime directorate. And of course, some countries don't know how many ships are in the Arctic, including, guess who? Our own. We know now more, and we use our assets, satellite assets, to look at some of the ships. But when we did this in 05 to 09, even the Coast Guard didn't have all the data in our own region. Now, the data, shipping, I should say, this report is actually it's a misnomer. It should be the Arctic Marine Activity Assessment, but that doesn't have power. And so we want to change the name midway through to be broader, to reflect what we were doing, looking at the numbers of vessels and blocks of the ocean, fishing vessels, cruise ships, tankers, tugs, barges, icebreakers, naval vessels, you name it. And we're looking at their emissions and discharges is what we're really interested in. So, this goes out, and if I asked everyone in the room what shipping is, you'd probably have 40 different answers, maybe. Because some people think shipping is tanker, container ship. And I might think that shipping is a cruise ship or a 300-ton fishing vessel. So, just the definition of shipping. We really were looking at the maritime industry in a galaxy of uses and sectors. And I'll show you how that played out. We used modern management technique and scenario planning, plausible futures. I'll show you a little bit about that. Human dimension, huge, integrating information from the indigenous people. Environmental impacts, really the only science chapter. And one of the fallouts is that we don't want to have an oil spill in the Arctic Ocean. So it's all prevention. We do not want to have large or small oil spill in the Arctic Ocean. Hard to clean up, maybe impossible. It could last for a long time in the Arctic Ocean. Well, a whole host of reasons. But we asked the scientific team, give us your number one thing. It wasn't alien species, ballast water, a whole host of other things. It was, as you might guess, oil spills in the Arctic. And then this loaded term is the infrastructure, search and rescue, environmental response, aids to navigation, buoys and satellite systems, and ports, and salvage, no salvage in the Arctic Ocean. And so salvage is an important component to the global maritime industry, and is located, even Antarctica has access to salvage from South Africa, South America. No salvage in the Arctic Ocean. So if you want to tow your cruise ship out or have a problem with the ship, who do you call? Who's the local salvage company? Well, they have to deploy for a couple thousand nautical miles. They might get there in a week, and that might not. I mean, I'm being a little cynical here. I don't mean to be too cynical, but it's an issue of there's infrastructure around the whole of the global oceans, not a lot in the southern oceans, of course, and almost non-existent, except for the coast of Norway and northwest Russia. Those are the only places where we have reasonable infrastructure. How much infrastructure do you think we have in America's Arctic? Probably Nick could answer this one. We don't have any infrastructure. The nearest Coast Guard station is Air Station down at Kodiak Island. Well, there's another, couple thousand miles of coastline. No ships. Well, the ships out in the Bering Sea do law enforcement for the United States, but the lack of no ports, except Nome has a port, very shallow port, and so we're challenged in the United States to develop the infrastructure, not only Coast Guard, but all the federal agencies and responsibilities. Oh, a little bit of climate change, just to change the subject a little bit. You probably have all seen this. I mean, it's factual. It's not model-driven. It's the temperature rise on the planet, but it is, it's greenhouse gas emissions and extraordinary rise since the Industrial Revolution. But if you look at some of the scientific data, it's the only map I have to tell you, I'll show you that's Mercator. Throw the Mercator maps away when you look at the Arctic. I couldn't find one from the science community that shows this amplification and the warming of the Arctic compared to the rest of the planet. So when you take any slice of data, and this is Jim Hansen in New York at the NASA Goddard Center, and this is some of his interpretation. But anyway, it's in the Northern Hemisphere, however you attribute the change, and I would say it's anthropogenic, but whatever is happening, there's a lot of warming of the North. And that has a tremendous effect, of course, on the sea ice, on the glaciers, on the permafrost, but I'll focus a couple slides on the sea ice. If you look at this record of sea ice extent, and this is coverage, this is based upon observed record early in the 20th century. This is a century record, almost, a little bit more than a century. And then from the 1960s, satellite observations and interpretation. But you look at this and you see in all seasons a decrease, constant. There's year-to-year variability, but all of the plots are negative here. But you also see that there's a lot of sea ice left, because if you start at 11 million kilometers, we're down to 6 million in the picture I showed you before. There's tremendous loss of sea ice. Now, this is only the coverage of sea ice. So if you really want to know about sea ice, you have to know the thickness and the volume of ice. But at least this shows you that there's tremendous loss of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. Take any kind of pieces of data. I don't want to dwell on all the technical stuff, but here's November, last 30 years. This is coverage again. The axis there is in extent of ice, coverage of ice in square kilometers. And again, whatever month you pick, it's decreasing. And back to these are snapshots again, and sometimes the science community doesn't like these because they don't show trends or anything. But for the diplomats and for the explaining this stuff to the world, these are quite helpful tools. These are all passive microwave, measuring the satellites measuring the back radiation of the Earth. It's passive, so it's not injecting any radiation. And it measures the difference of the radiation between the ocean and different concentrations of sea ice. And you get these fancy images. Well, in the past 30 years, I took these images, one back in 1980, and here, 30 years later, last minimum extent of sea ice last September in 2010. And you can see the extraordinary change and see these multiple colors. Most of this area would be negotiable by ships. Here, it's 100% cover. Probably thick, you can infer thickness of 4 to 5 meters. Thickness here, we can infer some of it from the satellite. It's 2 to 3 meters. So there's a great change in the character of the ice in the last 30 years, accelerated. And partly that is, you recognize this, as the sea ice retreats from every season, there's a greater and greater area that's ice-free and dark and absorbing all that sunlight. So there's a synergistic effect from year to year. So the ice is really, and we're going to reach a point where maybe 2 decades from now, whenever, you've probably heard about it, the ice-free Arctic, and the significance of that, maybe one day, maybe a week, it could be a month. The whole of the Arctic Ocean then, in subsequent years, will be covered by what we call first-year ice. None of the ice has survived. Some of this ice in this picture, this has survived several seasons. It's called multi-year ice, or old ice, but multi-year ice. And the character of the ice is much, it's like concrete or steel, because the impurities, this is frozen water, frozen seawater, of course, the salts and impurities, all of those in the crystalline structure of the ice, well, the salt melts out, leaches out. And so it's very difficult to break this kind of ice. The ice on the Great Lakes is much more difficult to break than some of the ice in the Arctic. The crystalline structure is aligned, it's nice and clear, and it's like a sheet of steel sometimes, especially when it has snow cover on it, makes it even more complicated. But this image, I put the red lines on there to show that at that point in time, the Northwest Passage through Lancaster Strait and through McClure Strait, through the Canadian archipelago, is ice-free. The report was that the Northwest, in newspapers, was that the Northwest Passage was open for business. And my response to it, yeah, for 2 weeks maybe, or 10 days. The rest of the time it's ice covered. So, I mean, you have to be there to navigate. I mean, you have to plan it out and be there. If you're trying to, I think the notion is, in the press, is that the free water ships of the world, Singapore to wherever they're headed, Rotterdam, are going to go through this. Like divert from, rather than headed for the Panama Canal, they head to port and go through the Arctic Ocean. Well, not yet, and maybe not likely for a long time. But anyway, if you look at the other side of the Arctic in this image, minimum extent on record, there's ice interacting with the Russian coast in Vilkitsky Strait, it's called. It's the most northern point in Eurasia. And you'd have to have a polar class ship. The ice-free ships couldn't ride across that. So this is the minimum extent. But we have to tell the diplomats to step back, look at the months before, prior to this minimum extent in 2007. Here's what the satellite images tell us, that the Arctic Ocean is ice-covered. It's about 2,200 nautical miles across the top of the world, from Bering Strait to the North Pole and out. This is called Fram Strait. So it's 2,200 nautical miles of ice, averaging 2 to 3.5 meters thick, so it's pretty thick. And it's for most of the year, well, at least for 6 or 8, 9 months of the year. The way to put this, I guess, is that the Arctic Ocean is ice-covered most of the year, meaning about 9 months, through the century and beyond. And from a climate standpoint, if we were melting the top of the world, well, you can be sure that myself and all of you wouldn't be worried about marine transport in the Arctic. You're worried about the rest of the planet frying at high temperatures. So the amount of heat to melt the winter ice at the top of the world would be immense. I'm not sure it's physically plausible, but it would be pretty hot in the rest of the planet. So we would believe, of course, that I'm not sure everyone would capture that in reading an article in the paper. The ice-free Arctic. Well, it's seasonal ice-free. Has implications for regulations, of course, and whatever. Increasing access, guaranteed. Easier ice conditions. There's some thought that now that we loosen up the ice and we have, it's more mobile on the operation of wind, it may be more complicated to navigate through certain parts of the Arctic rather than easier. even though the ice is thinner. So it is complicated. There are lots of factors. Let's turn to the seabed. This is a modern bathymetric chart, international group. I've got the North Pole on here, and I told you here that it's more than 2,000 nautical miles across from the blue dot to the red dot. The North Pole, I don't know if anyone knows how deep it is there. Anybody have a guess? Ask my Coast Guard officer friends. It's 4,000 meters, 2 miles down. So, it's not shallow. But the rest of the basin, particularly on the Russian side, Russians have the largest continental shelves on the planet. Of course, they contain, presumably, lots of oil and gas. Continental shelf around the Canadian archipelago, short continental shelf in the Beaufort Sea, but off Alaska, Chukchi Sea, it's all shallow water. And geologically, a huge potential for oil and gas. And I brought up the North Pole because you no doubt, everyone in the room read something about our friend, Dr. Cholongarov, taking the two submarines, the Mir submarines, down 2 miles to the seabed, planting the flag. His co-mate is an Australian, but you didn't read that the Australian flag is also there at the North Pole. He only heard about the Russian flag. A few of us thought we could get the Commandant to send the Healy over to pick up the flag. Technically possible. The Russians would be impressed and put the flag on Putin's desk, then Putin, President Putin. But you can't do that. Probably would be not diplomatic, but intriguing. They'd be impressed with the technology, maybe not with the politics. This has no bearing in international law. If you talk to all of the UNCLOS, law of the sea people, it's likely that the North Pole, it's likely that it won't be under anybody's territory because of the depth. It's hardly continental shelf. But there's a mechanism available, and there's an article. It's called Article 76 of the UNCLOS, United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, that allows countries to go beyond 200 miles around the whole of the global ocean. So that's what you hear is going on, and I'll mention a little bit more. But nonetheless, all of this media event, part of it was Dr. Cholongarov was a geophysicist, but he's also was then number 2 in the Duma. No, politics, internal politics, getting interest. He's a real scientist, wants Russian polar science to be funded, and he's a friend of Prime Minister Putin. So good combination. But it got twisted a little bit in its. If you ask the foreign ministry of Russia, well, they ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, because we haven't. We'll get to that in a bit. But it got huge media attention. Global race, or race for global Arctic resources, Time Magazine, etc. A tremendous operational achievement, though. I'm not sure I'd ride one of these little things 2 miles down with the ice cover, knowing what I know about ice. I don't know. But operationally, it's remarkable technology. Here's what the Arctic Ocean looks generally, a little sketch, where the Arctic countries today have 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And this is what's allowed under the UNCLOS. And here's one theoretical look at what the seabed will look like when the different countries' claims are adjudicated 10, 15, 20 years from now. Not much left that would be, let's say China wants to drill. I mean, China can drill in one of the EEZs, they just have to buy a lease and meet the regulations. But the only international seabed part left in the Arctic are probably a couple donut holes. So it's kind of fascinating dynamics. Now, the high seas, where freedom of navigation, innocent passage, and all that kind of stuff, is this area outside of the EEZ. So it's these potentially two areas that could be international development. Complicated place, another one of these maps. I told you I'd subject you, Wolfgang, to a bunch of maps, being a geographer. But one area, of course, of the Arctic is ice-free from the North Atlantic Drift and the Gulf Stream. Extreme cold temperatures, but available really ice-free for development offshore. So and it's in Arctic marine waters, but it's ice-free. The routes themselves, the Northwest Passage is 7 primary routes. The Northern Sea Route, has, I think, 11 different varieties and variations of routes. All of the routes have complicated sea ice dynamics and variability from year to year. People talk about going across the top of the world. They talk about going from Churchill in Manitoba to Murmansk, kind of an interesting connection between continents, which was not transarctic, intercontinental. So there are a lot of expressions. And of course, there are a tremendous number of huge challenges but opportunities here in this world. Let me run through a couple slides that deal with current use of the Arctic Ocean. The largest zinc mine in the world, many of you probably know, is in Alaska. It's the Red Dog mine. And large ships, bulk carriers, some of the largest of the world, none of them have any ice capability at all, come and anchor off Kivalina in Alaska, the port. Barges take out ore, and they take that product to East Asia, BC smelters, and around the Pacific Basin. But think the largest ships, they all come in the window of time, it's ice-free, come into U.S. Arctic waters, tightly controlled by the Coast Guard, monitored, but who would have believed? And right next door to, not on the map, but right next door, I've mentioned it, coal, the largest kind of high-grade coal in the world deposit is right in Alaska, northwest. And I guess you could think who might want to buy it, our Chinese friends. And so we think in the future there'd be marine shipping of coal, maybe from northwest Alaska. You hear about gas and oil all the time and the politics of it, but it might be coal. On the other side of the Arctic, I'm sure many of you have heard of this place called Norilsk, one of the largest industrial complexes in the world's mining town from the Soviet era to today. Now a large taxpayer in the Russian Federation. It's the largest nickel mine in the world. It's the largest palladium mine in the world. Well, let me rephrase that. Producer in the world. Fourth largest copper producer in the world. And I showed you a picture of a ship. I'll show you again. The ships are 24/7, 365 running between Dudinka and Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula. Modern ships running without icebreaker support. And the market, of course, is Europe and the world by ship out of Murmansk. Yet one other place, see if this is working now, is here on Baffin Island. The largest high-grade iron ore mine, potential mine deposit, is in Baffin Island. And probably over the next 10 years, there's an article in Wall Street Journal last week about it, the dynamics of the formation of one of the companies. It is this connection of this potential mine through ships, Arctic-going ships, to Europe, European steel mills, maybe to North America. I could go on. Fresh water is another wild card. A lot of fresh water, not from the Greenland glacier, but in lakes in Canada, lakes across the Russian Arctic. And fresh water, some would argue may be the new commodity, potentially, in the world. And fresh water is, in fact, sent from southeast Alaska to Asian ports today. It's bottled water. So we think that, and it would all be transported maybe by pipeline. Yeah, we joke, we send pipelines to Chicago, but it could be from Canadian lakes to Chicago, but it could be by ships to Saudi Arabia in the future. So we were focusing on all of the elements that would require marine transport. Here's this ship again, just to remind you of what it is. And extraordinary mix of technology and operational excellence. Very safe ship. Modern technology, Russian flagship. They have the resources to fund these ships. And next topic is sector is marine tourism. Has anybody been to the North Pole on a Russian icebreaker? I didn't think so, a bunch of academics. It costs $70K if you want to run and have a glass of champagne at the North Pole. But for me, looking at it, and probably for my Coast Guard colleagues, what a heck of a use of a national asset, a nuclear icebreaker. But looking for business, $70K times 100 folks keeps the payroll going in the maritime industry of the Russian Federation. I don't think, you think we'd take a Coast Guard icebreaker to the pole carrying a couple CEOs for a glass of wine? I don't think so. I don't know. But different culture, different view of the Arctic. Lots of tourism around the basin. The one, I showed you the picture of the cruise ship. I'll show you some more here in a second. About, on the average, the last few years, 300 medium and large cruise ships off the west coast of Greenland to places like Nuuk, and then smaller places. The question is, well, what are they doing there? Well, besides making money, right? A premium market. They come from the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. A few of the ships are ice capable, and the smaller ones, and built for special operations in the north. But most of them are, they come from Miami. And that's, here's one of them. This picture was taken 2 years ago off of Nuuk, Greenland. 6,500 passengers and 1,800 in the crew. So you got a larger city afloat than most of the communities in Greenland. And for the Arctic states, and for my personal interest, the environmental and safety implications of this behemoth in the Arctic are, I think, extraordinary. All of you, and not to frighten you from taking a wonderful cruise to the Arctic, see the last polar bear or the last glacier, whatever. I don't like to have my cynicism creep in, but no, I mean, they're great opportunities. All of these pictures are taken of cruise ships in Greenland, or off the coast of Greenland. Huge business. They come to the global marine tourism industries, come to the Arctic. Safe, not a lot of terrorism in the Arctic, hopefully, in the future, today and in the future. It's viewed as safe. Well, what's safe and what's the risks? What's the role of the insurers? We had a meeting in London, you probably won't want to hear this one, with the insurers, and they say, well, look, they're not operating in ice-covered waters. So, a little silence amongst the team of researchers doing this study and say, that's your basis for risk analysis. Oh, yeah. Yeah, but they have icebergs. Well, not many. When the water's cold, you put people in lifeboats, a few problems here, hypothermia, etc. What are the safety sets? The worst, probably, disaster that could befall one of these ships, of course, you could sink and flip over and that kind of thing, is a fire on board in the Arctic. Good luck. I mean, better be self-contained. Nobody's coming. Coast Guard's not that far, that close by. I mean, it takes days to get there. And you can't airdrop stuff. It's hard to do. You have a raging fire on a cruise ship. Hard enough for Miami. But I think there are some dimensions. The cruise ship industry has done a lot of work to shore up their environmental impact. But I think as they venture north and south, there's a bit more complicated picture here. Key fisheries, two of the largest fisheries on the planet, Barents Sea, and of course the Bering Sea. Bering Sea, the fisheries there is the largest fishery in America. Barents Sea, modest fisheries off Greenland and Iceland. But as the rest of the planet is overfished, there's a potential, and the planet warms at the top of the world, there's the potential, although there are some marine ecological questions about how the populations might move north. But nonetheless, it is an issue, and probably people want to fish in the Arctic because they can't catch any fish somewhere else. Whether the productivity will increase, there's lots of questions. But nonetheless, we expect to see more fishing vessels at high latitudes. Oil and gas is one of the biggest drivers, of course, of marine traffic in the Arctic, and one of the biggest industries. And most of the activity is here, northwest Russia, northwest Europe. This is natural gas development off Hammerfest in Norway, in Arctic Norway. The Norwegians realize they're running out of oil and gas, mostly oil, in the North Sea, moving up to the Arctic. National strategy, long term. They ship natural gas to Chesapeake Bay and to Spain, etc., around the planet. The Russians ship oil around the world, but they have a shuttle system between the Faraday Terminal, I'll show you in a minute. And so we have leases in Alaska, and politics and controversy over drilling in Alaska. Leases in Canada, same challenges, mostly focused on environmental impact on cultures of the North. And then, of course, we had last summer holes drilled in the seabed, coast of Greenland. I could say, again, cynically a little bit, that every Greenlander, all 56,000, pray every night. Find oil. Why? Independent country. Leave the 300 years of rule of Norway. So you could have the specter, it's very plausible, of a small Arctic state now rich Arctic state that's dependent completely on oil and development. I mean, it's possible because that's why they're drilling there. Tight regulations in Denmark, but nonetheless, you could say, so who would buy that oil? Us? Chinese? Europeans? No, there's huge questions. The driller is Cairn Energy from Scotland, the leaser, and then the driller was Stenner Drilling from Sweden. So it's all globalized oil and gas industry. And this is what this Faraday Terminal looks like from a Russian perspective. It's in the corner of the Barents Sea, the southeast corner of the Barents Sea, right off the coast of Russia. But here's a better picture, I think. This terminal, and this is a wild card because they're not drilling for oil here. The oil is piped from the beach to the offshore terminal and carried by these ice-breaking ships to Murmansk, where they stockpile oil in some old VLCCs, big tankers. I think this is a poster child for globalization of the Arctic. ConocoPhillips and Lukoil are the investors and the developers. The technology comes from ConocoPhillips, so American Russian company. The ship was built by Samsung in Korea, and the technology is Finnish. And the ship is Socomflot, the largest shipping company in Russia. So there's a galaxy, again, of investments and interests just in this picture. And we'll see much more of that in the future. There are...
Excuse me, I wanted to only bring this in as of last week. Everybody here knows BP, and Lawson have just bought BP's Arctic operations. And BP moving out from the Gulf, or reducing in the Gulf, moves into the Arctic.
Yeah, Rosneft, share swap between BP and Rosneft, and the focus is on this part of the world, the South Kara Sea, where there's and beach and offshore for oil. Most of the Arctic is a gas province. Well, last slide of this galaxy of uses is exploration of the seabed for science, but also for these claims. So ice-breaking ships and advanced research ships have applied in almost every corner of the Arctic basin in the summer. And so when you show the diplomats and all of the regulators and players, we say at the beginning of the 21st century, in the summertime, there are operations all over the place, different sectors. It's not like a couple ships are out there. That all sectors and all, it's not some of the numbers of the transits are not global numbers that compare to the global oceans, but nonetheless, there's use here. And not, the challenge, of course, is very few regulations behind all of this use. Some numbers, there actually been a number of voyages to the North Pole. I actually had a chance to go to the North Pole with the Polar Sea, doing science with the Louis Saint Laurent Canadian icebreaker. So there have been actually 7 transarctic voyages, and you can see the numbers. This is a picture of Soviet icebreaker back in maybe the good old days or bad old days. They were at the North Pole at almost the maximum thickness of ice. It's the only voyage of all of these where one of the icebreakers made it to the North Pole late spring. You can see the crew walking around the top of the world, which you can do when you're at the North Pole. You see the old Soviet flag there, maybe. But there's data, and it suggests that there's evidence of traffic in the central Arctic Ocean. Who would have guessed? Even I, icebreaker captain, wouldn't have guessed that maybe people would be steaming around out in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Not easy to do. They steam under, as you know, submarines, Russia, United States, UK, maybe China. My favorite picture of all of the slides I've collected up over the years, it's a then Soviet seaman with his shirt off at the North Pole, big ridge of ice. Ice is about 15, 20 foot thick. He's putting an ice anchor in the snow. Nick, remember all this stuff? Or we used to try to dynamite to move the ship and all that. That was craziness. I mean, we'd use dynamite down in Antarctica to blow a hole in the ice. It was great. I mean, it was exciting. It didn't work too well to move the ship. But then we put ice anchors sometimes out to hold the ship. And this is at the North Pole doing science. Nice sunny day, and he's got his shirt off, kind of in it or at the North Pole. Lots of linkages. The message is the Arctic today and the marine Arctic is linked to the global economic system in many different sectors. regional trade, global trade, etc. Not necessarily related to the Trans-Arctic notion, but most of it is destinational sailing in and out of the Arctic for natural resources. Another use of the Arctic Ocean, we have lots of data on where indigenous people use the Arctic Ocean, and not enough data, but we have some. And this picture was taken, I'm sorry that the cruise ship is off the picture. You wonder what this Inuit hunter is thinking about this new ship that he sees in his waters here in the 21st century and what the implications are to his cultural livelihood, etc. A lot of these scenarios, of course, are plausible futures. They help to tease out all the drivers and the interesting facets of future navigation. Complexity is the operable word. We had about 130 different drivers, but you can see the top 20 here. Transit fees, climate change, legal regimes. And one of these could change the dynamic of what is forcing the development of marine traffic in the Arctic Ocean. When we started the study, oil was at $127 a barrel. Then it went down during the study to 55, and it's 89 today. So it's very interesting. That one commodity price has a lot of bearing on the marine transport systems in the Arctic, as it has global economics, of course. Lots of different, we starred here, I've starred this major Arctic shipping disaster because if one happens, maybe it'll change the regulatory environment. And we had a couple things happen. This is the MV Explorer, happened down in Antarctica, and a week after I'm briefing the Arctic diplomats on this study, we say, hey folks, this is what we're talking about. You see all the happy customers in the lifeboat. It's a little chilly there, but fortunately, everyone was saved, the crew and the passengers. 100, well, the numbers are there. Small ship, historic, very excellent ship, actually ice strengthened. Pilot error, sailing too quick in glacial, iceberg-covered waters is the answer. Last summer, a couple exciting things in the Canadian Arctic, not necessarily ice-related. No ice, you see in the pictures. Both ships are aground. This Clipper Adventure from Miami is aground on a charted reef. At least the Canadians had it charted. But the notice to mariners that was sent out to check, to correct the chart, the ship didn't have, the Clipper didn't have that change, or had not put it on the chart. So simple mariner, important stuff, and they're aground. They're off now. The salvage team flew from Miami to come up here, and the people were rescued, no loss of life. This is a Canadian tanker on some sand. This is hard rock bottom. So this is all last summer, and you know, it piques the interest of our Canadian friends and the environmental regulations in the North. Here are the driving forces that we selected. A year study, internal in this, 60 people, meetings in Helsinki and around the Arctic and in San Francisco. Governance, either the lack of current regulations or a robust international governance system, non-discriminatory, and other driving our storylines was natural resource development. We don't see climate change on there because we don't think that climate change is the driver. We think it's economics as the main driver. Climate change is hugely important for all of us, for all the indigenous people, for the change in the permafrost, the sea ice, the glaciers. But for marine transport, economics. So you tease these things out. You can see our storylines. We wrote stories, a couple thousand-word stories. We believed when we started the study up in the Arctic race. Diplomats don't like the word race because they translate that to geopolitical race. We say, no, economic race. So, but anyway, we had to come up with creative words, and you know about scenarios, most of you, I think. And they're entertaining. They're all designed to tease out what are the driving forces, from my perspective. Wildcards, you see some in Alaska, the interaction of marine transport and bowhead whales and noise. This is what the picture looks like in the wintertime. Ice-covered, very dynamic, complicated environment. Bering Strait, one of the more, in the Bering Strait region, one of the more productive regions of the world, huge flyway and waterway for the marine mammals. So it's a hugely important ecological area of the whole of the planet and the Arctic. So complexity of the intersection of cultural uses of the Arctic And it's a wild card. How do these play out? Shell, 3 years ago, spent $1.3 billion to drill off Alaska. They haven't drilled a hole yet for a lot of reasons. Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, arguably reasonably liberal court, and they hinged there were challenges to the environmental impact statements of the federal government, so the lawsuits were against the federal government, not against Shell. So interesting dynamic there. Certain air emissions, this is more atmospheric chemistry, the lower troposphere of the cold troposphere of the Arctic has some inherent characteristics where if you pump in some noxious gases here, it could have some unintended consequences, like most things in the technological world. Here's this dynamic of going from the 200-mile EEZ to these two donut holes. The Arctic states, upon hearing a few years ago that there was a hue and cry for Antarctic Treaty, had to say to everyone, look, we own the place. When you look at all the terrestrial part of the Arctic and the EEZ, there's not a lot left over that's the common heritage of mankind, but people promote that. But let's slap an Antarctic Treaty on here. Well, we got people, sovereign territory for centuries, thousands of years, and I mean, it's an odd notion, but it's some press. So the Ilulissat Declaration, that's in Greenland, a little coastal town, the Arctic states met, and they say, well, no, UNCLOS is the framework. Because it's a complication for the United States. We haven't ratified the thing. And that might happen in the next 3-4 months, we'll see. And what's holding us from ratifying? I guess it's, one interpretation is that it's a small core of senators that essentially hate the UN. I don't think they necessarily hate or like the UNCLOS, but they don't like the UN having something to do with America. So there are arguments. You need 67 votes. Maybe we'll have them. The UNCLOS was designed by the United States, Soviet Union, Canada, for our interests in projecting power around the world, and having a system of territorial claims, etc. So anyway, this is an important wild card, not in the sense that it'll stop the other things going on, but the evolution of the claims may take about 20 years as they're adjudicated in the UN Commission in New York. So an important study was released by USGS, which said in July of 2008, the place, the Arctic is a gas province, likely not to be oil, mostly gas. And I put the red dots on one of their charts, maps. They're all coastal, so the implications for offshore development in all of these areas are huge for environmental protection, safety regulations, guidelines for oil and gas. They're mostly the national governments, but nonetheless, the probability of having coastal operations is huge for the Arctic, for the maritime Arctic. Technology I've talked to you about. As an icebreaker captain, and I think Mr. Mandy would echo this, you usually put the bow forward in the ice. New technology, ships are sailing stern first through the ice. It's called double acting, and in fact, the terminology is kind of interesting. You go stern ahead, so you have to figure out, Nick would remember this.
So where do you have the propellers? You have the propellers?
I think I have a picture here, let's see. This is the underneath shot of that ship I showed you. It goes to Norilsk. It's a pod that can go swivel 360. The electrical propulsion unit is in here. When you look at this picture, you say, well, is there anything missing here?
Yes, the rudder.
It is. Yeah, that's a good point. There's no rudder. It's a leading question. There's only one of these things. So if you work in the ice, lose propeller blades, you'd lose rudders. You don't have to lose a rudder here. But redundancy. So all those ships going to Murmansk and between Dudinka are like this. There are 7 of them, extraordinary ships, but they get in trouble, or they shear that off. Extraordinary technology, nonetheless. Has to do with fluid flow. I mean, my friend Nick could probably explain the ice and the flow of water around, but it's very efficient going stern through the ice. The Finnish technology. So an interesting link to the Arctic and future. And these ships are designed for independent operations, not in a convoy of icebreaking ships. Here is what most people think are the future of the Arctic. Some people think maybe we can connect the two continents by sea, but most of us that work in this field think it's destinational navigation. Up, perform some activity in the Arctic, and out. I won't completely dismiss the trans-Arctic notion, but I tell you today that it's not a new Panama or Suez Canal. You can probably quote me on that. There will be trans-Arctic navigation. A lot of the trans-Arctic navigation or destination will be out of Russia to China and taking resources out of the Arctic to global markets. There could be ships crossing the Arctic Ocean, but the bottom line is there would be thousands of ships, thousands of transits, lots of operations. They just might not be going from Asia to Europe across the top of the world. That's why Panama's building, enlarging the canal. They don't see, we went down, briefed them all on this thing, and they knew before we got there that there are plenty of ships in the world plying the Pacific that be plenty, maybe a few trans-Arctic ships, but most will still use the Panama Canal. Yeah, we could shut down the Panama, or we could even shut down the Suez Canal. It's happened before. But you'd have to, if it happened, you just couldn't send all those tankers across the top of the world because they're not ice capable. So it would be tricky to do. Not impossible, and it's plausible, but lots of findings in this study. I won't bore you with them. I've mentioned a few: winter ice, oil. How much? I'm over. Okay, 5 minutes or so. How to express all of this subject to the diplomats and to the world. And in this report, we had 17 recommendations, very eclectic, different ones. We focused on these three themes. It is all in the marketing of some of these reports. And as you might guess, it's safety issues and ship issues, people issues, environment, and finally this, hey, we have to have some infrastructure to support the marine world. And I'll just run through these. I've mentioned some: passenger ships, uniform, non-discriminatory regulations. The IMO is International Maritime Organization. Usually search and rescue agreement being negotiated now by the United States, Russia in the lead, to be signed by our Arctic ministers in, where are they going? New Greenland this May. What do you think our Arctic minister is for the United States? We've never sent the Secretary of State, but Mrs. Clinton, the Secretary of State, is going to go to New Greenland and represent our Arctic interests. So that kind of elevates things a bit. We've always had an undersecretary and somebody low in the organization, and the people say, hey, you're not taking this serious. Taking it serious, send the Secretary of State there to help sign this search and rescue agreement. She'll also meet with Lavrov and other ministers, but going to New Greenland for the Secretary of State is pretty interesting. Lots of engagement needed with the people of the Arctic. Lots of issues: oil spills, air emissions, etc., marine mammal impacts and strikes, a whole milieu of things. And then finally, this infrastructure issue: data, marine traffic systems, environmental response, mostly ocean data, met data, ice data, all pretty minimal in the Arctic Ocean. One of the interesting recommendations deals with surveillance, and we recommended that all ships be monitored throughout the Arctic Ocean, wherever they are, and all of the data on their positions, et cetera, be passed seamlessly between the Arctic states. And it's probably doable. I'm going to just go to the last slide here. Oops. How do I go back? There. I'll end here, I think. This assessment is baseline. It's the first study done for the Arctic that tried to take a holistic look of all of the ships and activities in the Arctic. It's imperfect. We didn't get some data we wanted from the Arctic states, but it's the beginning. It is a policy document, so since the United States signed up for this thing, the recommendations that we have in it, hopefully the U.S. will pursue all of and the other states, of course, all of these recommendations. It is, I think, a strategic guide for a whole host of stakeholders, investors, et cetera, actors in the Arctic in the future. So the Arctic states have been up to something with this study, imperfect as it is. Probably the Arctic Council hasn't communicated this well to the world But in fora, like the IMO and the satellite organizations, et cetera, and the maritime industry, they know of this study. I think I'll stop there. And because we still have time for Q&As. I still have my voice almost. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Why don't we bundle a couple of questions, please? Yes.
You mentioned that very early in your talk that about 5% of the Arctic is charted. It's hard to imagine the United States Navy sending multi-billion-dollar submarines under the ice without having a clear picture of what they're faced with. And so is that publicly available charts, or does it?
Some of that data from all the nuclear submarines for the past 50 years is available and is open and has been used in the bathymetric charts, but more recent data is not available. Yes, our submarines have, in fact, every time they go on a transit, made soundings and sonar soundings of the ice too. Whether it all meets international, it meets operational standards for safety for the submarines, probably doesn't meet true maritime resolution issues, et cetera. But we have a lot of data. Russians do too. Brits have some. Some of that's been fused in the bathymetric chart I showed you. Some has not. It would be useful to have all of that released. And there's a program ongoing. It takes forever to get that data released. But that wouldn't fill many of the gaps. I said 5 to 6% estimated. And the most intensely surveyed areas are Northern Sea route across the top of Russia in certain straits, and Bering Strait, as you might guess, in and around the United States, and several straits through the Northwest Passage across Canada. So, but those don't, I mean, they're regional, local, Bering Strait's international, but they really, there are huge areas of the Arctic Ocean where we have few soundings. And it may be 2 miles deep, but it could be, 100 meters deep somewhere else, not too far away. Good question, though. Excellent. Yes? Yep.
From an enforcement perspective, before the claims to EEZ are really ironed out, 2 Coast Guard cutters are probably sufficient to lay the flag. But once the EEZ has actually been laid out, what kind of enforcement mechanism would be sufficient to, I guess, is what we have currently going to be sufficient to enforce our EEZs, or our EEZ, considering the other nations are working on technology to do that once everything's...
Well, it's an excellent question about how do we enforce. Of course, I have to talk about what we want to enforce, probably in pollution regulations, marine safety regulations. If we have mandatory polar code in the future, do you go board? Do you check?
Excuse me, that I interrupt, by the way, for the students and my colleagues here at Princeton, we will have more strategic discussions tomorrow at the seminar. So,
But it's a good question. Right now, we don't have a lot of infrastructure. You know, in our old organization, doesn't have a lot of capability in the Arctic. The icebreaker I sailed on, the Polar Sea, and the Polar Star are 30 years old now, plus. New icebreakers cost $1 billion a piece, roughly. Yeah, current economic climate it's a tough budget climate for icebreakers. You have to argue the national issues. But icebreakers are not the only thing required. It's the proficiency of your people, fisheries enforcement, even the aviators have a role, right? Surveillance and oversight of our area. It's the presence of the United States in the area, in the region of the United States Arctic and throughout the basin that will become necessary. And it is likely, the Coast Guard is the instrument of national policy, because a naval ship has all these federal civil responsibilities, but it is a naval military ship. Likely, icebreakers in the future would be more of a combatant than they are today. Might have a gun, automalara, a little cannon or something, to show that it actually is a warship. I mean, people understand legally it's a warship, but I always wondered, we only had machine guns and small arms on the Polar Sea. And you could envision somebody from South America coming out with a kind of a little gunboat, and here's a big icebreaker, but we had pea shooters, so issues to be concerned about. It's a good question, hard one to answer, but there's a full range of federal responsibility for enforcement in the ice and out of the ice, and in the new ice-free area for at least 3-4 months of the year. Yes.
I take it that Canada and the US have differing interpretations over control of the Northwest Passage. I was wondering whether you could say a few words about what the impact of the US signing or not signing.
You mind if I ask where you're from?
You-
From?
Up north.
Yeah, good. No, not the probe. I could answer it. It wouldn't be different. No, of course, the United States not only disagrees with Canada, but with Russia on certain straits that we under law of sea, believe are international straits. And Russia and Canada have drawn strait baselines to call them internal waters, which has, of course, complete control of their waters. Vice international straits, we have a right of transit passage. So it's a fundamental difference. It's a legal nuance. I think I recognize I don't think it's a direct sovereignty challenge. I don't interpret that, but because I'm American and have dealt with these, you might, as a Canadian, say it's a direct challenge to sovereignty. I think our argument is we're not challenging sovereignty of all the land, and it's just this nuance of waterway, but it's hugely important to Canadians. I don't see that being resolved anytime soon, but I don't see us going to war. No, I mean, people think we are. No, people want to sell stuff, buy stuff, send resources, have a Mary River mine and use the Canadian Arctic. It's like just a nuance of the Northwest Passage. It's not likely to be international traffic, large volumes of traffic through the Northwest Passage. More likely to be across the northern sea route in the summertime, or even across the top. I mean, novel as it might be. Is that close to an answer?
Is there what would the impact of signing the Convention on the Laws of the Sea would be for the U.S.?
Well, I should mention. Well, on this issue, probably no change. In the law of the sea, as Canada and Russia have used, is Article 234, which gives the coastal state opportunity to have special rules and regulations for marine safety and environmental protection. So our Canadian and Russian friends say, hey, no, you're just using Article 234 as our leverage to do that. We have not, in the United States, haven't ratified the treaty, but would we apply this particular aspect of ice-covered waters in our own regulatory regime? We say, maybe not. Whatever IMO comes up with a polar code, we'd institutionalize that in federal regulations or law and use that as our tool to regulate the place. I don't see this. Well, of course, I'd interpret that this difference of opinion has nothing to do with the Arctic. It has to do with Straits of Malacca and other straits around the world, and the preeminence of American naval power and our ability to project around the world. Maybe South China Sea and a couple other places too. So you give. I think our position is you give a little bit here for whatever reason. But so we have a compact with Canada. What about the Russians? I mean, how it's actually useful, if it can be useful, this difference of opinion, that Canada and Russia have shared interests in this nuance of the law of the sea. You need to get an unclose person here to express it all. Unfortunately, not a lawyer. So, but I've been exposed to some of it. It is an excellent question. It's some friction, more than friction, between our two countries. But, we cooperate on this big study. We cooperate on science, cooperate, of course, the whole board. We're working at IMO together. We're doing all this stuff that related to the topic. We differ on this important legal difference, I guess is the way to say it.
Can we combine some questions, please? Yes, please, sir. And then
I can be shorter answering them.
yeah, and then because of
Yes, sir.
About 20 or 30 years ago, Esso or Exxon rebuilt a large tanker, and it made but one trip.
The Manhattan.
Now, does the change in ice and the price of petroleum change the parameter of handicaps?
Don't answer yet. Hold it, please. Other question?
I have a question. The law of the sea, ship captains and operators always have a I guess, a background of helping someone in distress.
Yeah.
One of the reasons is that we have means of keeping track of vessels in the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean. Is there any agency or any group or any mechanism set up now that we would know who's doing what in the Arctic seas at any given time?
Yeah.
I mean, do we know what the Russian ships are doing? Do we know do they know what we're doing, or what the commercial vessels? So that is there any,
Well, a couple components to this, but the first is that the search and rescue agreement should be signed by the ministers in May, should hopefully, in some detailed way, show the shared, not governance, but oversight of the different SAR regions in the Arctic. So that'd be a start. I don't think it talks yet about sharing data and information. Well, it would be for a case, but maybe not the total flow of data. But I think that's a critical thing, is that, most ships of the ocean today and in the future will all be tracked by AIS, 500 tons and higher, I think, in IMO world. So we'll be, but tracking and monitoring in the Arctic, a little trickier because some of the satellite coverage is not there. But it's a huge component to the marine safety and environmental protection, is knowing where everybody is, what the traffic is, the ice conditions, and how to manage that. And it has to be a tremendous amount of cooperation, maybe more than we've had in the past, is my answer. Back to the economic one. The Manhattan wasn't economic, as we know, compared to the pipeline which we built. But there might be some tanker passages across the Arctic Ocean, mostly from the Russian Arctic, Western Siberia to China. There were 2 last summer. And so the economics are there, no doubt, to carry. But whether you can sail across to the Northwest Passage from, let's say, off Newfoundland to markets in the Pacific is not clear, because it would be seasonal navigation. Probably even the Canadians wouldn't allow year-round navigation from a regulatory standpoint. So it's seasonal. So how do you use your ice-breaking tanker or ice-capable ship? Where do you use it the rest of the world in the non-ice-going season? So I think it's very complicated economics. I don't see an easy fit for tanker trade, but it can't be dismissed. You carry oil by pipelines. So we think in the future, across the Eurasian continent will be pipelines to China. But in this interim of a couple of decades, it's likely to be ships. So there may be opportunities. It's shipping gas, too, from offshore the United States. You could bring the ships up into the Chukchi Sea and take it to world markets. But then the state of Alaska, the great state of Alaska, I have to say, would not get much tax revenue. That's not going to happen. Pipe the gas to the beach and down the pipeline to Valdez or to Chicago, wherever. So I think the element of pipelines is a critical. And then, of course, pipelines are across the permafrost, which is melting, but that's another technical issue. Nick could answer some questions about that, but yes. Thank you. Good question.
To ask the last question, non-state actors.
Yes.
Especially also when it concerned mapping and from my own little naval experience, you have organizations, and there you have anything from Greenpeace to wherever. They must have unbelievable imaginary and geographic materials. And I know that you can easily acquire all kinds of satellite coverage. Can one, in a new regime where we have to think about cost efficiency and also perhaps the possibility of a bit more neutral activity, can one not sort of mobilize this and draw on that? And are non-state actors already actors there, or?
You mean mostly? You mean in the commercial world?
Commercial world, but also environmental world and other areas.
Yeah, well, of course, at the Arctic Council, we have UNEP there, and the UN agencies. We have WWF, Greenpeace, and others. But the commercial world hasn't been at the table at the Arctic Council. But they've participated. We had in this study, BP Shipping and Maersk Line participated in our scenarios work. Their interest was strategic thinking and planning on how they fit. So there is... Yes, I think the answer is that it's public-private and particularly for the infrastructure, public-private partnerships, or else it's not going to happen in the Arctic, because our tax dollars are not going to be used much for the infrastructure of Alaska. It'll be commercial interest in the port. Some will be, of course, for Coast Guard and other agencies. But that's a good question. Lots of players, a lot more players in the Arctic, which will have to be sorted out by not only the Arctic states, but by international organizations. One of the real big things is having international standards, as is around the whole planet. But for the Arctic, for the marine world, IMO, international standards, and the word non-discriminatory, because the Russians tend to discriminate different flags, I would say. Just a nuance of the operation of the Northern Sea Route. Depending upon who you are, what you pay, not maybe tonnage. So there are some issues to change of the cultural baggage of the Soviet operation in the Arctic, I would argue.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your
Thank you very
attention.
much.